Okay, good evening. Just a few days before Purim, often, many cancel Shiurim this week. People are getting ready, but I figured if you're preparing Shalach Manos, this is a good thing to do. Obviously, from the poster, if you saw it, we're not going to talk about Shabbos, but Purim instead, of course. The title of tonight is Secrets of Purim. We had a little alliteration of halachos, Haman, Hadassah, and more. So I want to begin with this. This is Megillas Tainus. Megillas Tainus is the oldest Torah Shebaal Peh ever written. Okay, so this is from the Second Temple era. As obviously, you can still get a hold of it. These are, and we've talked about it before, but for those that don't remember, these are some 20, 30 odd dates throughout the Jewish calendar that were celebratory, or very unique events were commemorated throughout the year. If you recall from Megillas Esther, Haman makes a comment about the Jews and how, according to one interpretation, one of his complaints to Achashverosh is they always have days off. There's always a religious holiday. And at the time, that was true. It wasn't until the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash that we got rid of all of these. So these really run through, really from the days of the prophets all the way through the second Beis Hamikdash. When the second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, we got rid of all these. And we talked about that on Hanukkah, because Hanukkah is really just one of 30 dates in Megillas Tainus. And the Gemara asks, why do we keep Megillah? Why do we keep Hanukkah? And the Gemara gives an odd answer. It seems to say, this is, when I look it up, it's in Rosh Hashanah 18b, Yud Ches Amud Beis. The Gemara says, you know what? You're right. We did get rid of Hanukkah, but the people liked it, so they kept it. Very strange answer. But anyway, so the other day I was curious if this was written before the end of Bayesheni, then Purim should be in here. Now, you remember, we don't know who wrote Megillas Esther. I mean, if there's time tonight, I could talk about it. And I know many of you are screaming it was Esther, and others are screaming it was Mordechai. And then you're remembering from the Megillah, they wrote it a second time. So who wrote it the first time? And I don't want to get into that. It's actually a very interesting discussion between Mordechai and Esther, who actually completed Megillas Esther. And then you have to wonder what's with the name Megillas Esther. And people say, oh, she must have written it because it's called Megillas Esther. Well, Megillas Rus is not written by Rus. Megillas Shira Hashirim is not written by Shira Hashirim. So that's not evidence. But what Esther did do, without a doubt, is once she completed Megillas Esther, she wanted it to become part of the canon. And the Sanhedrin told her no. Now, if this would happen today, I don't mean to be political, but there's no doubt, whatever side of the aisle you're on, and maybe I'm on your side. If Esther would have appealed today to the Sanhedrin told her no, they would have said, it's because she's a woman. That wasn't the reason why. The Sanhedrin had a very considerable fear, among other things, of publishing a book of Jewish victory at a time when it's a little bit of a nail in the eye of the enemy that we're celebrating our defeating them. And there are other reasons too. But Esther appealed and she finally won. But until that time, it would seem that it was written in Megillas Tainus. So I was curious to know how it was recorded. I will say something, and I see my wife is on, and I may get in trouble for saying this. Maybe I shouldn't say it. But I'm going to tell you something before I read to you how the earliest Torah Shebaal Peh records the events. Now, at the time Purim was entered, Esther was already accepted part of the canon, just includes it in the list. But I do want to say something. I want to say this very carefully because I don't mean this facetiously at all. We know that when there were female prophets living, there were over 1 million prophets throughout our history. We only know of some 40, 50 of them. Those are the ones that are, canonized in the Tanakh, but there are many, many more, men and women. And even within the Tanakh, we know of Devorah, we know of Esther, we know of Huldah, we know, of course, of Miriam, we know of Sarah. I mean, there are many female prophets. The Gemara tells us that in the time of Devorah, the male prophets would get to their office And, they would turn the open sign on the door and they would sit there, waiting for a customer, but nobody came. Everybody went to Devara. Why? Because prophecy is not like the movies. It's so sad that the Goyim appropriate Sabbath and Messiah and prophecy from us, and we learn from their appropriation about our own religion. It has nothing to do with what you see in the movies or how Christians. Prophecy is very deep and it's interpretive. It's not like Moshe Rabbeinu. Torah is something else. Nevi'im and Ksuvim. It's not like Moshe Rabbeinu. It's interpretive. So if you're going to an interpretive seer, you're going to want to go to someone who is empathetic, and you would choose a woman. But it occurred to me this year that, and again, we're going to get back to Megillas Taanis. It occurred to me this year that, if I'm not mistaken, in all of Tanakh, the only book written by a woman is Esther, potentially. And so I give that introduction because what I'm about to say may seem politically incorrect, but I do not mean it politically incorrect. I forbid anybody from repeating it unless you repeat everything I said, because it can be interpreted wrong. I'm so scared to say it, but I don't like to hide what I believe is MS, and I believe this is true. The reason why it's so secretive, Esther, and what you see, there's a lot more that she's really saying, it's because it's written by a woman. Women have a different way of talking than a man. I don't mean this facetiously. I brought the Gemara to prove that women had a different way of interpreting Nevuah. And it is true that if you read any of the other Sifrei, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim, it's not as mysterious as Esther. And I think that is because of her taking part, a woman taking part of the writing, which is very unique. So this is what happens when a woman writes a Sefer. It becomes so teeming with mystery and brilliant because of that. So, I want to be very careful. This is not a negative, God forbid, quite the contrary. So with this in mind, what the Megillas Taanis records is actually something which is brought in Chazal. And I want to read to you the words because it's very important to know going into Purim. Megillas Taanis says as follows. Ba'arbeisar ba, this is obviously in Aramaic, on the 14th of it, ubechameisar Bay, and on the 15th of it, meaning of Adar, Yemei Puraya, that's Aramaic for Purim. Now, we're not going to go into tonight why this holiday is called Purim, because every sentence we say about Purim is mysterious. Like Purim, the lottery is such a footnote of the story of Haman, Achashverosh, Mordechai, Esther. Why we title it that is so bizarre, but leaving that aside, and the headline is, the Lola Mispad, we can't give eulogies. That's what Megillas Taanis says. And then it makes a statement. Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, says the famous Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, Miyom shemes Moshe, from the day Moshe died, lo amod navi v'chidesh mitzvahs liyisrael chutz mi mitzvahs Purim. Purim is the most unique day in the Jewish calendar, and it is. It is the only day that was designated as a Yom Tov after the death of Moshe Rabbeinu. We're not allowed to add to the Torah. There's no such thing as a celebratory day. Now, certainly, you could have private celebratory days. In fact, that's a halacha. If your family goes through a miracle or has a day of survival, you're supposed to meet, maybe say Shachiyanu once a year. You can speak to a Rav how to handle that. But to establish a day as a Yom Tov, I mean, think about it. Is there any other day from the day of the death of Moshe Rabbeinu until today? It doesn't exist. And as we said, Hanukkah has been abolished, but this is a Navi stating it, which makes it even more profound. It makes it a matter of Jewish law. And he's bothered by this, and Megillas Taanis is bothered by this. And it gives two interpretations. By the way, we could ask on this, that's not true, because most dirabbanans, most rabbinical laws granted are only there to protect Torah laws. However, there is something called a mitzvah dirabbanan. Lighting candles for Shabbos is a mitzvah invented by the rabbis. Netilas yadayim, brachos before meals. There are many examples of this. The explanation of that is that when we say something is derabbanan, we tend to think of like Rabbi Akiva or Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. We know that Yitzchak, when he brought Rivka into the tent of Sarah, her candles relit, meaning derabbanan doesn't mean it started in the days of the Talmud. Derabbanan is a type of law that predates the Talmud. It could go all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu. This is the only mitzvah de Rabbanan that did not exist in the days of Moshe Rabbeinu. So it gives different interpretations as to I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it explains why this is not a violation of that law. But I wanted to read this to you because of the following. Just give me a moment here. Let me just find what I'm looking for here. Give me one more second. Okay, I can't find it. But okay, interesting enough, but it's an interesting question. But we'll stop here because I can't find. This is the commentary. I'm trying to find something in this commentary. I can't find it right now. But it's interesting enough. This is a unique day. Purim is a unique day. Okay, so with that introduction, let me now share with you a few things about Haman, about Hadassah, about the Megillah, maybe some halachas, time allowing. The first thing I want to share with you is something I discovered just this week. I mean, this is hot off the press. So every year when it comes to Purim time, so as I mentioned before, I have to write a column a week, which is never fun. This is almost 12 years. Well, Chama could tell me if I'm right. I think it's 11 and a half years now, or 12 and a half years every week. Could you imagine? For at minimum 11 and a half years, 1,500 words a week. So it's always hard coming up with ideas. So Purim time, I'm just going to write about Purim. But I've written 12 times 1,500 words on Purim already, really more than that, because sometimes the week before I write about, and I was thinking, what should I write about? And I decided to write a column called Haman, a biography. That was going to be the name of the column. And as I've said before, sometimes when you write, you don't know, like you start writing an introductory paragraph, and before you know it, you wrote a whole column before you even got to your main point. And that's what happened this week, because I started off just by saying Friday night in shul, for those that come here Friday night, I have this custom that I ask questions before Baruch Hu when the rabbi speaks for a few minutes. So, rabbis do different things. In most shuls, the rabbi doesn't speak. In the shuls that rabbis do speak, maybe they'll learn the laws of Lashon Hara or something else. So I developed this custom for my first week in the rabbinate that I get up and I just ask interesting questions on the parsha, some of which I don't have answers to, or I'll tell you tidbits. And a few years ago, Parshas Lech Lecha, I got up and I said, the most famous story in all of Chumash is the story of Lech Lecha. It's what children first learn in yeshiva. We all know the story of Avram and Terach and Sarah. But let me ask you a question. What was Avram Avinu's mother's name? It's a very simple question. And typically the audience is silent. Well, that's weird, right? What is Avram's mother's name? Seems to be important. We know his father's name. And in fact, by the way, if you want to look it up, I think it's in Perek Chaf, Pasuk Yud Beis, his mother, Avram, does reference his mother once, not by name. He says that Sarah, how he's related from my father's side, not my mother's side. That's the only reference to Avram's mother. So there's a Gemara in Bava Basra. And I'm writing this out, I have this custom of asking questions. I once asked in Lech Lecha, who was Avram's mother? And this will all come to Purim. And this is an interesting Gemara because the Gemara wants to know the mothers of Shimshon, the mother's name of David HaMelech, and then eventually the mother's name of Avram Avinu. It's like the Gemara for mothers. There are certain mothers and fathers for that matter, but this Gemara is about mothers who aren't mentioned in Tanakh. Who were they? So the Gemara, when it gets to Avram, it does something very interesting. Now, if there's more time, I really maybe should share my screen. I could show it to you inside, but I'll just say it outside to speed up because we have so many things to get to. I mean, we could go to midnight talking about Purim. So the Gemara says, listen to this Gemara. The Gemara says, a maid Avraham, the mother of Avram's name was Amasle, and her mother's name was Bas Karnuva. And then the Gemara says, and the mother of Haman's name was also Amasle, Bas Arvite. Strange Gemara. First of all, well, let's even finish that. So the Gemara again, David HaMelech's mother is this name, Shimshon's mother's name is not mentioned in Tanakh, it's this name, and Avram and Haman's mother had the same name. So the Gemara then ends, the simanach, and the mnemonic to remember this is Tameh, Tameh, Tahar, Tahar. Haman was Tameh, and his mother was impure, and Avram was pure, and his mother was pure. So There's so many obvious questions. The first one is, what's the connection between Haman and Avram? We're talking about tzaddikim in Tanakh. We want to know their mother's name. So tell us Avram's mother's name. You want to a little bit later say, by the way, Haman had the same name. Do that, but to put them together, and it's also a name that doesn't exist anywhere else. So is there a connection? Second of all, why are you telling us their mother's name and their mother's name? That seems to be irrelevant. And third of all, a mnemonic? What am I going to forget? Avram is the Tahar, the pure one, and Haman is the Tameh one. And also a mnemonic for what? They both have the same name. It's not like typically in the Gemara, Simonach is a memory tool. It's an aid for recollection, which doesn't seem to be necessary here. So I don't want to spend too long on this. So I'm still writing. Right now I'm like 600 words in. I'm like, where am I? Which happens sometimes when you're writing. And because I'm asking these questions, I never even thought about it as I'm writing. So I start doing some digging. And without getting into Kabbalah, Al Pi Kabbalah, the name Amasle Bars Kunuva, if you say that, I don't want to tell you how often, how many times, when you have to speak to people in power, kings, ministers, and you say this a certain number of times, it's a very special segula. In fact, when they open up amulets, they find this name inside. Okay, I don't want to go into it more detail. And on the flip side, Amasle Bas Arvite, the mother of Haman, if you say that a certain number of times, when you're contending with a scheming Russia, you say that a certain number of times, you'll be saved. There is this concept that wicked in Kabbalah, wicked can't mix with wicked. So, for example, the Medrash says, and again, I don't like to speak about the mystical, but the Medrash in Bamidbar Rabbah says that when Korach's wife walked into Gehenna, into hell, hell cooled. And it's explained because a Russia is like ice, a Russia versus a Russia. Anyway, okay, I guess maybe there's something mystical here. But then I said to myself, I have another question. This is a great question that certainly relates to Purim, but definitely this Gemara. It says Tameh, Tameh, Tahar, Tahar. I know Haman is Tameh. Who is this Arvite? Amasle, I should say, Bas Arvite. Do we have any evidence that Haman's mother was wicked? Why does the Gemara assume that? I mean, you can unmute yourself. Has anybody here ever heard anything about the mother of Haman? I mean, if you're silent, good, because I was silent. I had no clue. And then I actually spent about 3 hours looking, and I couldn't find a thing. And then I'm thinking, 1 second, what about Avram's mother? 10 minutes ago, nobody knew Avram's mother's name. And now all of a sudden, the Gemara says, Tahar, Tahar. Avram is Tahar, pure, and his mother's Tahar, pure. Who is Amasle, the mother of Avram? Do we know anything about her? By the way, was Avram's father pure? No. Terach was a Russia. So why do we assume that just because Avram was Tahar, the Gemara gives us a mnemonic, Tahar, Tahar. Maybe his mother, like her husband, was bad. So I did some digging, and I discovered a medrash that I never saw before. This is a medrash that's called Medrash Maaseh de Avram Avinu, the medrash on the life of Avram Avinu. You can't buy this in stores. If you have certain svarim at home, which are not very popular svarim, you could find this unprinted medrash in the back. Baruch Hashem, I have it at home, and I never went through it before. I'll be honest, I don't remember if I ever heard of this medrash before, but I look in the back of a certain sefer, and it's there, and I start going through a medrash which doesn't exist anywhere else about the life of Avram Avinu. And of course, I start at the beginning because that's where Amasle is. And it says, Terach married a woman who was very special. At the time when Terach got married, she became pregnant. But unfortunately, Nimrod his necromancers told him that from the stars they see that a male will rise up and perhaps unseat you, will be very powerful, which sounds like Paro and Moshe. And in fact, Nimrod says, I'm going to kill all the baby boys. So when a woman will become pregnant, they built a palace for the women to convalesce, but really it was a pretext to give birth to them in this palace. And if it was a girl, they sent them off with gift, and it was a boy, They told me it was stillborn. Amasle recognized this. She also recognized her husband was a Rasha. So she didn't tell Terach that she was pregnant. One day she's expecting. It's called hukar ubra in Aramaic, meaning she's showing. And Terach says, are you expecting? And she says no. And he went to feel the baby kick, and Avram Avinu, the fetus of Avram Avinu, went up into her chest. It was a miracle, into her chest. At that point, Amasle recognized that she can't hide anymore, and she ran away, claiming business or something, and she hid in a cave. And she gave birth to Avram in a cave and left him there so he wouldn't be killed by Nimrod. The angel Gavriel comes down and starts feeding Avram. In the meantime, Amasle is saying, my son must have been eaten by animals. This sounds now like Yaakov and Yosef, and she starts mourning for him. She's inconsolable until Gavriel, some 20 days later, returns Avram to her. Okay, it's an amazing story. That how does it help us for Purim? Because I still know nothing about Haman and his Amasle, his mother, with the same name. And I'm going to tell you something that gave me goosebumps. Okay, so for those that are coming a little bit later, Avram Avinu's, the Gemara says, Avram Avinu's mother's name was Amasle, and Haman's mother's name was Amasle. One was Amasle bas Korbana, one of them was Amasle bas Arifte. The Gemara gives us a mnemonic, the Tahar versus Tame. And we asked all these questions. What's the connection between Avram and Haman? And that they both have the same name. Why do we need a mnemonic? And who says that Avram's mother is a tzadekis and Haman's mother is a Rasha? So we just proven that Avram's mother is a tzadekis. But I couldn't find anything about Haman's mother, I said, which is true. So I don't have, Bar Ilan, Eitzar Chachma, I don't have all these search tools. And I don't typically do these searches. But I went on to Sefaria.com, which is a website, not a religious website, but a very reliable Tanakh and Svarim website. And I wanted to do a Gemara search for the word Arifte. Because what does Arifte mean? Karnuva, for Avram's mother's mother, there is a meaning I don't want to get into. It means a dove down pillow. It comes from the word karim, for a down pillow made out of dove feathers. So what does Arifte mean? I'm telling you, if you've been following this, I'm about to give you goosebumps. So I do a search, Arifte. In all of Torah Shebaal Peh, the spelling Arifte, Ayin Reish Yud Beis Tes Yud Hey, only appears twice in all of Torah Shebaal Peh. The first time is the Gemara I just mentioned, which is Baba Basra, page 91. That Gemara, Haman Amasle, Avram Amasle. The second and only other time in all of Medrash, in Bavli, Yerushalmi, Sifra, Sifri, Zohar, the only other time Arifte exists is in the following Gemara in Kedushin. Listen to this Gemara, it is wild. It's also about pedigree. Interestingly enough, Rabbi Yehuda was visiting the town of Nehardai, and he was unhappy with the marriages there. He was unhappy with the divorces there. And he starts saying how, not everybody here is a real Jew, or maybe they're mamzerim, whatever. Well, what do you do to a rabbi who nullifies marriages? You throw him out of town. So they threw Rabbi Yehuda out of town. So Rabbi Yehuda is leaving town. And he says, I don't know why. If you would have just asked me, I would have explained. Explain what? Amar Shmuel. Shmuel said, in Nehardai, there are two lines of pedigree. One is compared to a dove, B'nai Yonah, and the other is compared to B'nai Arifte. The only other time in Talmud the word Arifte is used. Now I know what Arifte means. Oh, it means raven. And you know how that Gemara ends? V'simanach. And a mnemonic to remember this is Tameh, Tameh, Tahar, Tahar. And I searched. These are also the only two times in all of our oral tradition. The word Tameh, the phrase Tameh, Tameh, Tahar, Tahar is only used twice. By Haman and his mother Arifte. And here, the only other time Arifte is used in all of Shas. And the mnemonic is Tameh, Tameh, Tahar, Tahar. Don't ask me what it means. I don't know what it means. I have no clue what it means. I was writing, and thank God I got to the number of words, and I just said, I don't know. I tell the reader, this is too much. Like, I don't have the skills for this. But it's such a great demonstration. The truth is, I do have a theory. I'll tell you my theory. My theory is Karnuva, I told you, meant a dove down pillow, Karim, and a rifte now for Haman and a raven. The Yonah and the raven are always battling in Tanakh. By Noach already. The raven is the word for raven is Arab, which is bara, backwards, right? Ingrained in evil. Yonah throughout our literatures compared to Klal Yisrael, the Bnei Avram. So there is this battle between the Orev and the Yonah. I mean, there is something here. But this is, we tend to forget that in the Gemara itself is so many secrets. My son, who lately has been obsessed with Kabbalah, when can I learn Kabbalah? Tell you Kabbalah. So there are times when I'll give him an answer to a question which is non-halachic, and he'll say, is that Kabbalah? Oh, I know. It's Kabbalah from the Gemara. It's like Kabbalah we're allowed to know. So that's Kabbalah. I don't know if we're allowed to know. And I spoke to a few Talmidei Chachamim who never saw this anywhere. And again, they didn't believe me. They searched themselves, and it is the only two times these things are. Okay, wow, I didn't expect you so much time. If you have Megillas Esther, open it up. We'll take the next 10 minutes or so to learn a little bit of Megillas Esther inside. I like to say every year, as I opened, it's called Megillas Esther. That doesn't mean she wrote it, just like Megillas Rus. It wasn't written by Rus, and Shir HaShirim was written by Shir HaShirim. The Sfarim tell us that Megillas Esther is actually speaking to everything we said until now. The word Migaleh means to reveal. The word Esther means hidden. Megillas Esther means the revelation of the hidden. Because that's what everything Purim is all about. Even costumes. Who is behind that costume? Everything we do, you drink because Nichnas Yayin Yotzei Sod. When you drink wine, out come the secrets. It's all, Purim is a Migaleh Esther. It's a revelation of who you really are. Because you're free. You could be whoever you want. You could dress up however you want. You could have the meals, whatever you want. You could have an excuse to say whatever you want. Okay. I also want to mention, before we look at the Megillah inside, we're not going to have that long, 10 or so minutes, that something else that I also say, I like to say every year. I don't know if I say it every year. These are my two favorite ideas. Everybody knows, and it's actually Gemara, that not in all instances, but in certain instances, when it says the word for king, Melech, in Megillas Esther, it's an allusion to God. And that's a medrash. The reason why Chazal say that is because God's name is not found anywhere in Megillas Esther. How is that possible? How could we canonize? Maybe Chazal Sanhedrin was right by rejecting Esther. Why should we canonize a book in Tanakh that doesn't even mention God's name? It's not a religious document. It doesn't belong in Tanakh. You could hear that argument. So obviously it is a religious document. I mean, the reason why, and as Ira just said, there are many allusions, which is why the Gemara tells us this. The reason why the Sanhedrin wanted to reject it is because it could lead to anti-Semitism. So she had to hide. Again, Megillas Esther. Sometimes in life, we have to dig to find God. And this is a work of Galus. This is a work of suffering and exile and seeing a redemption and convincing ourselves initially. This is all about democratically elected, or in that case, monarchs convincing them and gifts. No, it's God. But I want to tell you my favorite explanation. And before I tell it to you, it's so wild what I'm about to say, because I would never say this on my own. And that's why it's almost a dangerous idea. And I want to quote who it's from. I may not find it. I believe it was from the Sichas Musar who says it. Okay, so I don't want to waste too much time looking for it. I believe it was the Sichas Musar who says it. Listen to what he says. This week's Parshas Tetzaveh, whose name is not mentioned in Parshas Tetzaveh?
Moshe
Moshe Rabbeinu. Why isn't Moshe Rabbeinu's name mentioned in this parsha? Because in next week's parsha, when the Jews sin, Hashem wants to destroy us. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, okay, but listen, I'm a leader. I love these people. These are my flock. And I would be an utter failure as a leader if under my watch, I allow them to be destroyed. So if you do destroy them, erase me from your book. Hilchos Musar says, not the Sichas Musar, the Shevet Musar. I'm sorry, the Shevet Musar says Hashem was so inspired by that. That's a leader. Years later, he remembers this. And he said to himself, if I ever would have allowed the Jews to be destroyed even for a moment, like he was going to do, Hashem was going to destroy us. And then he forgave us. But then he remembers Moshe Rabbeinu. Look at me. Why can't I be a leader like Moshe Rabbeinu, says the Shevet Musar. The fact that I, as a God, under my watch, would allow my flock to be killed, even though I allowed them to do tshuva, but until that point, like Moshe Rabbeinu, mechena mesifracha, erase me from your book. And isn't it a great secret that Parshas Tetzaveh is always read this time of year? It's amazing. Isn't that amazing? Okay, now we have like 6 minutes. Okay, to the psukim, to the Batmobile. So how many psukim could we get through? I want to talk a little bit about Haman, a little bit about Achashverosh, a little bit about Mordechai, a little bit about Hadassah and Esther. How far we're going to get? Probably nowhere, but let's see how far we could go. Okay, so the opening of Megillas Esther, I mean, the truth is, Haravis Rivenu I wanted to discuss, the Brachos I wanted to discuss, but we'll skip all that. So the if you have a pasuk in front of you, Megillas Esther in front of you, Vayihi b'mei Achashverosh, maybe one of the most famous 3 words in all of Tanakh, and the Gemara tells us in Megillah Daf Yud that any Vayihi b'mei, any event in the Torah that starts with Vayihi b'mei, very famous, it's a lashon sar. It means bad things are about to happen. So last year, I don't want to go back to this for this year, we spoke about what the purpose is of the first chapter. You know, the story really begins in the second chapter when he's looking for a new wife. And you can't say the purpose of the first chapter is the death of Vashti, because it never says Vashti was killed. I hate to break it to you. You can look 100 ways from Sunday. It never says Achashverosh killed Vashti. So we talked, I asked that question last year. We spent the whole year discussing it. I'm sure nobody remembers my answer because I probably can't remember my answer. I have it written somewhere. But I want to ask a slightly different question. If Vayihi b'mei is a language of here we go, you know, it's like that moment when you go up the roller coaster and tick, 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 and then you feel about right when you're over that arch, that's Vayihi b'mei. So everybody asks, I'm not saying we shouldn't have this first chapter, they're asking, but the Vayihi b'mei starts in the second chapter. However, we answered our question last year of what the purpose of the first chapter is. The negative things only start in the second chapter. So you may say, well, we ate by the Sudas Achashverosh in the first chapter. And that's what caused us to sin, right? Because the Sudas Achashverosh was kosher, right? It was under the Vada Persia. That the Gemara says that. Mordechai was the Mashkiach, but it wasn't about the kashrus. Not everything's about halacha. Never forget that. I always tell the girls' school that I teach in, you know, the Veira of the spies is not found in the Shulchan Aruch. It never says anywhere in the Shulchan Aruch that when you come back from Israel, you're not supposed to say how dangerous Syria's army is or how big the grapes are. So if we're smart, there are Veiros that are really so bad that I not even mention the Shulchan Aruch. But the problem with that answer is the Jews eating at that meal is not really discussed inside the text. So I'll give you a very pshat-oriented interpretation. Vayihi b'mei is because this all happened because you have a king who was easy to manipulate. You have to remember, like the opening of the pasuk is Vayihi b'mei Achashverosh. You ever notice that throughout Tanakh, when a king is introduced, they're called Melech? It should be Vayihi b'mei Melech Achashverosh. Instead, it says Vayihi b'mei Achashverosh, Hu Melech mehodu v'ad kush. It should call him Melech Achashverosh. Why is he called Achashverosh, Hu Melech. What a weird thing. So this is all one question, because the answer to the negative that's happening now is they have to remember Achashverosh was not a typical Melech. Usually a Melech is an inheritance of some type. There is a stock that you belong to. He was not among them. He was Achashverosh, who became a Melech. Esther was very smart in her choice of words. And that's the Vayehi Bimei, that it was him. The fact that, and the Rishonim say this, not me, the fact that he would be such a prude, not a prude, the opposite of a prude, so immature as to have his wife be called out naked. He had no class. You're dealing with someone who was trash, who was real trash, who was in a position of malchus. His opulence, his showing off, all of this was the Vayehi Bimei. This was the problem. And that's what gave Haman the Pesach to enter and manipulate him. And this also really answers in a different way last year's question. The opening sets the scene of a king who's naive, a king who is very insecure, who has to have the fanciest of everything, not just for his best friend kings, but for every member of society, that they have to look at him in awe. And he's easily manipulable. And how do we know that? Because he didn't know what to do with Vashti. And he asks, and Memuchan comes for, no one wants to give an answer. And then Memuchan, lo and behold, he follows Memuchan. This is the problem. I don't know if I've ever said this before. I've said this in the Gemara share. I'm going to say this here. This is a highly charged statement, but it's not really. This is not about gay marriage or the Iraq war or any issue. It scares me greatly as a Jew, whether, let's take gay marriage, for example. Maybe you think gay marriage is the best thing, and maybe it is. It's an amazing thing that from 2008 till 2023, the pendulum swung. If you go online, go to Gallup, it's all free. You can look at it, how it went from 80% against to 70, 80% for. When you live in a society, and that could be the good thing, right? And look at Israel, it's great, it goes up. The love of Jews is better than ever. But this all scares me. So this is not about agreeing or disagreeing. That we live in a manipulative society because we're all consuming the same beverage, we're all consuming the same information, or the same 5 pieces source of information. The fact that a society could swing, where's it going to swing next? At a certain point, it comes back to us. That's what scares me. It's not about politics. It's about anti-Semitism, and it scares me. So that was Achashverosh. He was easy to manipulate. Chashverosh, the Gemara says, he gave us headaches. We got headaches from him because we never knew what was going to happen next. You know, it's like with Trump, whether you like him or not, if the worst thing to happen is if you have a political ideal that aligns with Trump, the last thing you want to happen is someone on the other side of that ideal to compliment it. Because if he gets complimented, he could switch sides in a second. And I think Achashverosh and Trump really do go together. I'm aligned. Listen, I was walking in Yerushalayim with my wife, and we saw the embassy there. I mean, there are so many things. I'm happy, but it's all about manipulation. And Baruch Hashem, he was manipulated in the right direction. I always said that's the source for having hangovers after Purim. Achashverosh gave us headaches, so we have headaches. Okay, so let's just skip a little bit. That we're already over time. Again, I could go mamash till midnight, but let's at least talk about. We don't have time to talk about Mordechai, so I'll just talk about Hadassah. So now we're in Perek Beis. So the introduction of Esther is an interesting one. Because the pasuk says, "Vayhi Omein," he raised Es Hadassah, he Esther. So that's strange. It's not very often in Chumash or in Tanakh that we'll be told someone's name, and that's really the person's name. So the Gemara really asks this question. The Gemara says, "Kari le Hadassah, v'kari le Esther." The Megillah calls her Hadassah and also calls her Esther. Which one's her real name? So the Gemara actually has a debate. So Tanya Rabbi Meir Omer, we learned in a brisa that Rabbi Meir said, Esther Shema, her real name was Esther. That was Shema Ha'amiti, her real name. V'lama nikra Shema Hadassah. Why was she called Hadassah? Al Shem HaTzadikim Shnikra Hadassim. Because the righteous are compared to the myrtle branches. It brings a pasuk in Zechariah. The myrtle branches, the way they stand up, is that this was right after we were exiled, and the tzaddikim who are going to survive the exile have angels that stand with them like myrtle branches. You know, if you know anybody who survived the Holocaust, or there are very deep spiritual things happening when Hashem chooses who's going to survive, and to do that, the Kabbalah, what's standing by that person that they survived is called Hadassim. Okay? I don't understand it. That's opinion number one. Opinion number two is Amar Rabbi Yehuda. No. The opposite. Hadassah was her real name. Hadassah Shema Ha'amiti. Esther's real name was Hadassah. V'lama nikra Shema Esther. But why was she called Esther? Al Shem Shahaisa Mistares Estivereha V'lo Gilsal Achashverosh. Esther comes from the word secret. Remember, we said it before. Megillas Esther. To be Megaleh, reveal Esther, secrets. So Esther was her name because she kept quiet. In fact, the Svarim tell us a fascinating thing. Why were the Jews saved? Because everybody knew who Esther was. Every Jew knew that Mordechai raised her, and nobody opened their pisk. Nobody told the palace. That they were able to keep a secret is why they were saved. So Esther herself kept her secret. Reb Nehemiah in the Gemara, we're continuing the Gemara, he also says Hadassah was her name, but why was she called Esther? Because in Persian, or I don't know if this is true in Farsi today, I didn't look it up, a star is a celestial body. Maybe a star means the moon. It seems from the Gemara, it seems like it means the moon, but she was as beautiful as a star. Esther, a star, the Gemara says. It's spelled Aleph Samach Tes Hey Resh, a star. She's beautiful as a star. Which is one of the reasons why Mordechai raised her, because she was very beautiful and she didn't have a home and obviously didn't want her to be taken advantage of. So you could only imagine after Mordechai takes her in for this purpose, when there's this call for women, what he has to go through. We didn't get to Mordechai. We certainly didn't get to Haman. I'll just tell you, we'll end with one last thing. There are certain people that Haman is compared to. We already compared him to Avram as being polar opposites for the first 30 minutes of the shiur. But the Medrash actually compares Haman to somebody else. The Medrash says that Haman and Korach are from the same cloth. They were both very wealthy and tried to take down the leader of the generation. It gives other examples. Then I was thinking, this is so interesting, because what else do Korach and Haman have uniquely in common? And I'll give you a hint, because I mentioned it earlier in this year. Korach and Haman are the only two people I could think of in Tanakh whose wives convinced them to be evil to the leader. Korach, his wife said, he comes home and he's all shaven, and his wife says, "Who did this to you, Moshe Rabbeinu? Why is there tchelas?" And she's the one who convinced him. And Haman's wife, Zerah, she says, she's the one who convinced him to build a tower. That's very unique in all of history, because there's not that many evil women, I guess, because the two times there were, it just shows you the importance of who we associate with. And talk about manipulation. Achashverosh was easily manipulated. Apparently, Korach and Haman were too. I'll tell you one last thing about Haman is that, and there's more, by the way, I'll just tell you, I'm not into gematrias, but I started thinking this week that Korach means ice. Literally, it means ice. Kerach. Because what did he do, Korach? He took the Torah, which is compared to water, Shifchi Chamayim Libech, and he solidified it, because Torah is a back and forth. It's malleable like water. But he took a position, Korach, and he said he's not budging. He turned Torah compared to water, he turned into ice. That's what I always believed to be the secret of his name. And then I started thinking, 1 second, Haman is Gematria Mayim, Hamayim. So whereas Korach took the Torah and hardened it, Haman was even worse. He didn't even think you have to follow it. He invented his own rules. He was the water. I'm not into gematria, but I thought it came to me this week that that's what their names mean. Maybe it's true. One last thing is that according to Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz and other Sifrei Kabbalah, not that we understand anything about Kabbalah, but according to these opinions, Haman was a Gilgal, a reincarnation of that Mitzri in Parsha Shemos that was beating up a Jew that Moshe killed and covered in sand. And Mordechai was a reincarnation of Moshe Rabbeinu. In Kabbalistic tradition, I don't want to go into Gilgulim, but there are certain people in our life that when you meet them, you just hate them or they hate you. And that could be a remnant of a past relationship. So Mordechai and Haman, the Me'am Loyas mentioned this, they had it out for each other because of these past Gilgulim. And I'll just point out, my name is Moshe Mordechai. And I would suggest that that's where the name, because it's not an uncommon name, why Moshe and Mordechai go together very often is because maybe they'll Gilgulim. Andy Klein shared, what I once mentioned this, he had surgery this week. It should be a schos. He said, no, there's another reason why it's called Moshe Mordechai, because anybody born on Zayin Adar, they're going to want to name Moshe because that's Moshe Rabbeinu's birthday. But if you're born on Zayin Adar, when's your bris going to be? Your bris is going to be on Purim, so you're going to want to name them Mordechai. So Purim bris is an automatic Moshe Mordechai, and that's how the name became popularized. So many secrets of Purim. We learned together for about 50 minutes. As I said, I really could go to midnight if you want to volunteer. I can never get enough. Next year, Mosaic Press is going to be publishing my Purim book. So I'll hopefully give everybody a copy. It's not going to come out for at least a year because we have other Svarim coming first, but we have the galleys already. Anyway, have a good night, a happy Purim, a good Shabbos. We'll see you soon. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.